Chapter 1. The Arrival of a Stranger. Jacob walked through the buzzing Varen city, an uninviting mix of shimmering skyscrapers and low-hung, ancient structures that jutted up like bones from the planet's volcanic rock. Vara was nothing like he'd imagined. The sky was a constant shade of burnt orange, the twin suns casting long shadows even at noon. People around him, tall, sleek, and obsidian-skinned Varens, gave him quick, cautious glances before moving on. He was the only human around, which had its drawbacks. His ship was lost in an ambush 2 weeks prior, leaving him with little but the clothes on his back and a small pouch of tools. With each passing minute, Jacob's stomach churned from hunger, his legs wobbly from exhaustion. The last credits he'd managed to scrape together had been enough for a small meal, but not enough for a place to rest. Yet he was determined. Jacob had always been resilient, a skill picked up over years of drifting from planet to planet. But resilience didn't solve his immediate problem. He needed a place to stay or risk sleeping in the open under the piercing gaze of Varen patrol drones. Clara's Haven was the only place that looked both affordable and approachable. It wasn't exactly inviting, with its faded, cracked sign barely clinging to the wall and layers of dust coating the windows. Yet, the building held a charm, a nostalgic reminder of places he'd stayed in before. As he pushed open the door, a soft chime echoed through the dimly lit lobby. It was warm inside, a comforting escape from the harsh winds of the street. Behind a cracked wooden counter stood a tall Varen woman. Her face was elegant, with sharp angles softened by faint lines around her eyes. Her silver gaze was both intense and curious, scanning Jacob with the sort of scrutiny that made him feel as if she could see through him. "Human," she said in a voice that was both cold and melodic. "What brings you to Clara's Haven?" Jacob hesitated. He hadn't expected such an imposing figure to run a small lodge. Her presence was magnetic, and something about her made him feel small. "I need a room," Jacob stammered, regaining his composure. "But I don't have any credits." She raised an eyebrow, her gaze hardening. "No money, yet you seek shelter. Do you take us Varens for fools, or are all humans this bold?" "Please," Jacob said quickly, lowering his gaze. "I can work. I'm a skilled mechanic, a quick learner. I'll do anything to earn my stay, at least for a short while." The woman studied him for a long moment. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. "Very well," she said, though her tone was still sharp. "I am Clara, the owner of this establishment. I'll allow you to stay under strict conditions. You will work each day, repairing and maintaining my property. And if you fail or overstep, you'll be out on the streets faster than you can say thank you. Is that understood?" Jacob nodded fervently, his relief palpable. "Understood, ma'am." Clara led him to a small, humble room at the back of the lodge. It was nothing fancy, but to Jacob, it was a palace compared to the cold streets outside. After thanking her, he collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion sweeping over him. As the sun sank below the horizon, their dual light fading into an eerie twilight, Jacob lay awake, reflecting on his strange predicament. This wasn't the first time he'd found himself in an alien land with nothing but his resourcefulness. But this place felt different, the atmosphere heavier, the people sterner. He sensed it in Claria's demeanor, in the watchful eyes of the locals, even in the architecture that loomed over him like ancient sentinels. Something about Vara was unyielding. His thoughts drifted to Clara, the stoic woman who had taken him in against her better judgment. She had agreed to let him stay, but it wasn't out of kindness, that much was clear. Her scrutiny reminded him of a drill sergeant he once had, someone who never took anyone at face value. Yet, despite her cold exterior, there was something else, something he couldn't quite place. A sadness? A burden? Or perhaps it was just his own exhaustion playing tricks on him. The next morning, he awoke to the sound of a faint knock on the door. Still groggy, he sat up as Clara opened the door slightly, her silhouette outlined by the warm glow of the hallway light. "Get up," she commanded, her tone clipped. "If you're to earn your keep here, you'll need to start working. There's an old heating unit in the lounge that hasn't worked in years. Fix it, and maybe I'll let you stay another night." Jacob nodded, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he quickly dressed. She had left before he could thank her, her footsteps receding down the hall with a grace that seemed to reflect her reserved nature. As he entered the lounge, he immediately saw the heating unit, a relic of a bygone era, by the looks of it. Its metal casing was rusted, and a layer of dust coated every visible part. But Jacob had worked with worse. Rolling up his sleeves, he got to work, inspecting the internal circuits, untangling the mass of wires, and wiping away years of grime. Hours passed, and as he delved deeper into his work, he became aware of Clara's presence nearby, watching him silently from the corner. The other tenants, mainly older Varen men and women, peeked in from time to time, casting wary glances at the human laboring in their common area. He could feel their mistrust, their whispers barely concealed, but he ignored them, focusing solely on the task at hand. After a while, the hum of a revived heating system filled the room, and a wave of warm air spread throughout the lounge. The Varens stared, surprised, as the once-defunct unit came back to life. Clara nodded approvingly, her silver eyes gleaming with a hint of satisfaction. "You did well, human," she said, though her voice held an edge. "Perhaps you have some worth after all." Jacob couldn't help but smile, even if he knew she was reluctant to praise him. He'd gained a small victory, and maybe a chance to stay a bit longer. As he packed up his tools, Clara lingered, her expression softening ever so slightly. "You must have seen many places," she remarked, her gaze drifting out the window. "Tell me, human, what brings you so far from your home?" Jacob paused, surprised by her sudden question. He had expected a transactional relationship where he worked and she allowed him to stay. This was different. He hesitated before answering, trying to gauge her curiosity. "I don't have much of a home anymore," he replied, his voice low. "I go where the wind takes me. Lost my family a long time ago, and since then, I've just kept moving." For a moment, they stood in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Clara's gaze grew distant, her usually guarded expression softening. Jacob realized she wasn't as closed off as she wanted others to believe. There was a fragility hidden beneath her stoic exterior, a vulnerability he could almost feel. Chapter 2: Repairs and Revelations. Days passed, and Jacob began to fall into a rhythm at Clara's lodge. Each morning, he woke to find a note slid under his door, listing the day's tasks in Clara's sharp handwriting. The tasks were varied, from small repairs around the lodge to more technical fixes on ancient machinery he was unfamiliar with. Clara's haven had been neglected for years, and the list of repairs seemed endless. But with each completed task, the lodge seemed to come back to life, as if Jacob were somehow breathing energy into its walls. For Jacob, this work provided a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. He had drifted from planet to planet after the war, taking odd jobs and surviving on the fringes. But here, in this forgotten corner of Vara, he was needed, even if only for menial repairs. And in the process, he found himself drawn to Clara, the stoic landlady who managed the lodge with an iron will. Clara watched him from a distance, always observing but rarely speaking. When she did speak, it was usually to issue instructions or to offer curt praise. Yet, in those brief exchanges, Jacob noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. Her gaze would linger a second longer, her voice would soften, and the walls she'd built around herself seemed to waver. One evening, as he finished repairing the aging heating unit in the main lounge, Clara entered, her footsteps light but deliberate. She studied the room, her silver eyes taking in the once dormant unit, now humming with warmth. She nodded, a faint glimmer of approval in her expression. "You've done well, human," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Thank you, ma'am," Jacob replied, though he couldn't hide his surprise at her unexpected praise. Clara hesitated, glancing out the window where the twin suns were setting, casting long shadows across the city. "I rarely allow outsiders into my lodge," she began, her voice tinged with something Jacob couldn't quite place. "Especially not humans. But you are different." Jacob wasn't sure how to respond. He could sense there was more she wanted to say, but Clara had always been guarded, revealing only glimpses of her true self. He decided to take a chance, hoping to break through her defenses. "Why did you take me in, Clara?" he asked gently. "You didn't have to. You could have easily turned me away." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Because you reminded me of someone? Jacob felt a pang of curiosity mixed with empathy. He knew little of Claria's past, but he sensed that it held scars, just as his own did. He wanted to ask more, but he held back, respecting her boundaries. The silence stretched between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken words. Finally, Clara turned to him. Her expression softened. "You're a skilled mechanic, Jacob," she said, her tone gentler, "and a hard worker. You've brought life back into this place, something I thought was lost long ago." Jacob smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the heating unit. "It's been an honor to help. This lodge, it's more than just a building, isn't it?" Clara's gaze dropped, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It was my husband's," she admitted quietly. "He built this place, poured his heart into it. After he passed, I thought about leaving, selling it, but I couldn't. It was all I had left of him." Jacob's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. He understood loss all too well, the weight of memories that clung to places and objects long after the people were gone. Without thinking, he reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Clara," he said softly. "I know I'm just a stranger, but if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." For a moment, Clara tensed, as if his touch had startled her. But then she relaxed, allowing herself a brief moment of vulnerability. She looked up at him, her silver eyes searching his face for something, though he wasn't sure what. "Thank you, Jacob," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "You're different from other humans I've known." He chuckled softly, trying to lighten the mood. "I'll take that as a compliment." A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips, the first he'd seen since he arrived. But just as quickly, she composed herself, the mask of the stoic landlady slipping back into place. "Enough talk," she said, her tone firm once more. "You still have work to do. The water pipes in the basement are leaking, and I expect you to fix them by morning." Jacob nodded, though he could sense the subtle warmth in her voice. Their connection, fragile as it was, had grown stronger, and as he made his way to the basement, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of hope, a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time. In the days that followed, Jacob's relationship with Clara continued to evolve. Their interactions, once terse and businesslike, became warmer, filled with shared stories and unspoken understanding. Clara opened up little by little, revealing glimpses of her life before the war, her dreams and ambitions, and the love she had shared with her late husband. But as their bond grew, so did the rumors. The Varan townsfolk had noticed the humans staying at Clara's lodge, and their whispers grew louder with each passing day. Jacob could feel their eyes on him whenever he walked through the market or ventured into town. The townspeople's distrust of outsiders, especially humans, was deeply ingrained, and their disapproval was palpable. One evening, as he returned to the lodge, he overheard two Varan men talking in hushed voices near the entrance. They spoke in their native tongue, but Jacob had picked up enough Varan over the years to understand their conversation. "Why does she let him stay? A human of all things," one man muttered. "Perhaps she's lonely," the other replied with a sneer. "Or perhaps she's gone soft." Jacob clenched his fists, forcing himself to walk past them without reacting. He knew he had no right to be angry. He was, after all, an outsider. But the words stung nonetheless, a reminder that he didn't truly belong. Inside, he found Clara waiting for him in the lounge. Her expression was unreadable, but he could see the tension in her posture, the way her hands clenched tightly at her sides. "I heard the rumors," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of frustration and sadness. They think I've lost my mind, letting you stay here." Jacob took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "If it's causing you trouble, I can leave," he offered. "I don't want to make things harder for you." But Clara shook her head, her gaze fierce. "No, Jacob, you've done more for this place than anyone else ever would. Let them talk. They don't understand what you mean to this lodge. Or to me." Her words hung in the air, charged with an intensity that neither of them had anticipated. In that moment, Jacob saw the depth of her loneliness, the burden of responsibility she carried, and for the first time, he realized that perhaps he was more than just a tenant to her. They stood in silence, both struggling to navigate the uncharted territory of their feelings. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stay, Jacob, as long as you wish." He nodded, a sense of belonging settling over him like a warm blanket. In Clara's eyes, he saw something he hadn't felt in years, a glimmer of hope, a chance for a new beginning. And as they stood together in the quiet of the lodge, Jacob knew that their journey was only just beginning. Chapter 3: Shadows of the Past. The following weeks brought a shift in the dynamic between Jacob and Clara. Their interactions were no longer purely transactional. An unspoken understanding had developed, a quiet companionship that neither of them would openly acknowledge. Jacob continued his repairs, but now his work was often accompanied by Clara's presence. She would silently observe, sometimes lending a hand, but more often simply watching. Her silver gaze softened in ways Jacob had never seen before. In the evenings, they would sit together in the lodge's lounge, sharing stories over modest meals. Clara spoke of her husband with a mixture of pride and sorrow, recounting his bravery as a soldier, his fierce loyalty, and his dreams of building a safe haven. Jacob shared stories of his own, memories of a childhood on a war-torn planet, his dreams of exploration, and the painful losses that had shaped him. As their conversations deepened, Jacob sensed a part of Clara that longed for the connection they shared, but he also noticed the walls she'd built around herself, walls fortified by years of loss and survival. He didn't push. He simply listened, allowing her to open up at her own pace. But their growing bond did not go unnoticed. The townsfolk's whispers had grown louder, turning into open disapproval. Jacob would catch the locals glaring at him when he ventured out for supplies, their faces twisted in disdain. He could feel the weight of their mistrust pressing down on him, but he did his best to ignore it. After all, he was used to being an outsider. One night, however, the tension reached a boiling point. Jacob was in the lounge, fixing a broken light fixture, when a loud banging echoed from the front door. Clara, who had been in her quarters, appeared at the entrance, her face darkening as she opened the door to reveal a group of Varen men. They were tall, imposing figures, their expressions hardened with hostility. "What is the meaning of this?" Clara demanded, her voice sharp and commanding. One of the men, an elder with a stern face and piercing eyes, stepped forward. "We've come to address a concern, Clara," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You are harboring a human, a stranger with no ties to our people. This is unacceptable." Jacob tensed, feeling the weight of their accusation. He knew that his presence was unwelcome, but he hadn't anticipated such open hostility. Clara crossed her arms, her expression unyielding. "Jacob is my guest," she replied coldly. "He has done nothing to harm anyone. If anything, he's helped restore this lodge, a place none of you cared about after my husband's death." The elder's face twisted with anger. "That's not the point," he snarled. "Humans cannot be trusted. They bring trouble wherever they go. And you, Clara, you are a widow, vulnerable. We worry for your safety." Jacob stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear simmering within him. "I understand your concerns," he said, trying to maintain a calm tone, "but I'm here to work, to earn my keep. I mean no harm to anyone." The elder scoffed, his gaze filled with disdain. "And yet, you take advantage of a grieving widow's kindness, worming your way into her life. We won't allow it." Clara's face flushed with anger. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice carrying an authority that silenced the men. "Jacob is my guest, and he will stay as long as I permit it. If you have a problem with that, you can leave." The men exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. But they knew better than to argue with Clara. She was a respected figure in the community, and though they disapproved of her decision, they could not openly defy her. With a final glare, they turned and left, their footsteps echoing through the silent night. As the door closed, Clara let out a shaky breath, her composure slipping for just a moment. Jacob reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice filled with gratitude. She looked up at him, her eyes flashing with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. "Don't thank me," she replied softly. "You've earned your place here, Jacob. They're just too blind to see it." In that moment, Jacob realized just how much he meant to her. She had defended him, stood up to her own people for his sake. It was a powerful gesture, one that spoke volumes about the bond they shared. The confrontation, however, left a lingering tension in the air. Jacob became more aware of the gazes that followed him whenever he stepped outside, the whispers that trailed him like shadows. He knew that his presence was a source of discomfort, and he couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to escalate. A few days later, his fears were confirmed. Jacob had ventured into town to pick up supplies when he was ambushed by a group of young Varen men. They surrounded him, their expressions hostile, their voices filled with thinly veiled threats. "You think you can just waltz into our city, human?" one of them sneered, his fists clenched. "Taking advantage of Claria's kindness? You don't belong here." Jacob raised his hands, trying to defuse the situation. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just needed a place to stay, and I'm doing my best to respect her and her lodge." But his words fell on deaf ears. The men were not interested in reason. They were fueled by prejudice, by a hatred that ran deep within their culture. Before he could react, one of them lunged forward, striking him across the face. Jacob staggered back, the pain radiating through his jaw. He fought the urge to retaliate, knowing that any act of aggression would only confirm their suspicions about him. "Leave," another man spat, "or we'll make sure you regret staying." They left him battered and bruised, their laughter echoing through the empty street. Jacob stumbled back to the lodge, his body aching, his spirit wounded. He had been through worse, but the incident left him feeling defeated, a painful reminder of his status as an outsider. When he arrived, Clara was waiting for him, her expression darkening as she took in his battered appearance. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice laced with concern. Jacob hesitated, not wanting to burden her with his troubles, but the look in her eyes compelled him to be honest. "I was confronted," he admitted quietly. "Some of the locals don't take kindly to my presence here." Clara's face hardened, her silver eyes blazing with anger. "This is unacceptable," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "You've done nothing wrong. They have no right to treat you this way." Jacob placed a hand on her arm, trying to calm her. "It's all right, Clara. I've dealt with this kind of thing before. I can handle it." But Clara shook her head, her expression fierce. "No, Jacob, you shouldn't have to handle it. You're my guest, and I will not allow anyone to harm you." In that moment, Jacob saw the depth of her loyalty, the strength of her resolve. She was willing to stand up to her own people for his sake, to defend him against the prejudices that had plagued him his entire life. A wave of emotion washed over him, and he found himself reaching for her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she tightened her grip, her touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to fight this battle alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We'll face it together." As they stood there, hands entwined, Jacob felt a newfound sense of belonging, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. In Claria's presence, he was no longer an outsider. He was part of something larger, something meaningful. But he knew that their journey was far from over. The challenges they faced were only beginning, and the path ahead was fraught with danger. Yet, as long as they stood together, he knew they could weather any storm. Chapter 4. Unbreakable Bonds. The days after the confrontation in town passed in a tense calm. Though no one dared to openly attack Jacob again, he and Clara both knew the townsfolk's resentment simmered just beneath the surface, ready to erupt at any moment. Despite the hostility, Jacob continued his work, determined to keep his promise to Clara and repay her kindness with the best repairs he could manage. But he could sense the unease in her every time he stepped outside, her silver eyes tracking his every movement from the lodge's windows, as if to make sure he returned safely. One evening, as they shared a quiet meal together, Jacob broke the silence. "Do you regret taking me in?" he asked softly, studying her face for any flicker of hesitation. Clara's gaze snapped to him, her eyes hardening with resolve. "No, Jacob," she said firmly. "I do not regret it. I regret the closed-mindedness of my people, their inability to see beyond old prejudices. But you've done nothing but bring life back into this place." Her words touched him deeply, but he could sense the burden she carried. He had become more than just a guest. He was a part of her world now, and he could see how that connection strained her, knowing that it went against the unspoken rules of her society. Maybe I should leave, Jacob suggested quietly. I don't want to make things harder for you. I don't belong here. Not really. But Clara shook her head, her expression fierce. You belong where you're wanted, she replied. And you are wanted here, Jacob. I have lost too much already. I will not lose you too. The strength in her words surprised them both, and for a moment, a fragile silence settled between them. Then, almost impulsively, she reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. Her touch was warm, grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in years. You don't have to keep running, she whispered, her voice laced with a vulnerability that made his heart ache. Stay. Stay here with me. Jacob looked into her eyes, feeling the weight of her words sink into him. She was offering him a home, a place in her life, something he had lost long ago. And in that moment, he realized that he wanted her. I'll stay, he promised, his voice steady. As long as you'll have me. They held each other's gaze, an unspoken understanding passing between them. It was a vow, a silent agreement to face whatever came their way together. The next morning, however, their resolve was tested in a way neither of them had anticipated. A heavy knock sounded at the door, loud enough to rattle the walls of the lodge. Jacob and Clara exchanged a glance before she moved to answer it, her expression wary. When she opened the door, they were greeted by a group of Varen officials, their uniforms pristine, their expressions stern. Clara of House Morov, one of them intoned, his voice devoid of warmth. We have received complaints regarding your human guest. The council has deemed his presence a disruption to the peace of our community. Clara's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening. Jacob has done nothing to disrupt the peace, she replied coldly. He is my guest, and he has earned his place here through hard work and respect. The official's gaze flicked to Jacob, his expression unreadable. Regardless, the council believes his presence is inappropriate. We are here to escort him out of the city, for the safety of our people, as well as his own. Jacob felt a surge of anger but kept his composure, knowing that any outburst would only worsen the situation. Clara, however, was less restrained. You have no right to interfere in my affairs, she said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. This lodge is my property. I decide who stays and who goes. The official sighed, his tone growing colder. With all due respect, Lady Clara, you are making a dangerous choice. The council has been lenient with you because of your family's legacy, but your defiance risks your standing within this community. Are you truly willing to sacrifice that for the sake of a human? Clara hesitated, and Jacob saw the conflict flicker in her eyes. He knew what she stood to lose if she continued to defy them, the respect of her people, the security she had worked so hard to maintain. It would be so easy for her to let him go, to end this before it cost her everything. But then she looked at him, her gaze unwavering, and he saw her decision. Yes, she said firmly, her voice filled with quiet conviction. If that is what it takes, then yes. Jacob will stay. The officials exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by her defiance. After a tense silence, the lead official inclined his head, a hint of respect in his gaze. Very well, he said quietly. But know this, Lady Clara, you are now responsible for his actions. Should any harm come to our people as a result of his presence, you will bear the consequences. With that, the officials turned and left, their footsteps echoing through the silent lodge. As the door closed behind them, Clara let out a shaky breath, her composure faltering for the first time. Jacob stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Thank you, he murmured, his voice filled with gratitude. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Don't thank me yet, she replied softly. This isn't over. They'll be watching us now, waiting for any excuse to turn against us. Jacob nodded, understanding the weight of her words. They had crossed a line, one that could not be uncrossed. But as he looked into her eyes, he knew he would stand by her, no matter what. In the days that followed, they faced increased scrutiny. The townsfolk's glares grew colder, their whispers louder, but neither Jacob nor Clara paid them any mind. They had made their choice, and they would face the consequences together. One night, as they sat together in the dimly lit lounge, Jacob reached for her hand, a gesture of solidarity and affection. Clara looked at him, her silver eyes softening as she squeezed his hand in return. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "I am grateful for this." Jacob nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "So am I." They sat in comfortable silence, a quiet strength binding them together. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, that they would face challenges and prejudice, but they also knew that they had each other. And that, for now, was enough. Epilogue. Over time, the hostility from the townsfolk faded, replaced by a grudging acceptance. Jacob continued to work at the lodge, his skill and dedication winning over even the most skeptical of the locals. He and Clara became a fixture in the community, a symbol of resilience and defiance in the face of prejudice. Together, they rebuilt the lodge, transforming it into a place of warmth and welcome, a haven for travelers of all species. And as the years passed, Jacob found something he had never expected: a home, a family, and a future filled with hope. And Clara, once a grieving widow haunted by memories, found peace in his presence, a love that healed the wounds of her past and gave her the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their bond, forged in adversity and strengthened by loyalty, became a story whispered through the city, a reminder that even in the most unlikely of places, love and acceptance could bloom.